It's just before midnight in the Bronx. A woman finishes her shift caring for adults who depend on her every day, the kind of work most people never think about until they need it themselves. She heads toward her car on a street she knows well, one she's walked 100 times before. Tonight, she doesn't make it inside. Officers respond to a call near Murdoch Avenue in the early hours of July 13th, 2026. What they find sets off one of the most unsettling family cases the Bronx has seen this year. Investigators say the person responsible isn't a stranger lurking in the dark. It's someone who shared her home, her family, her last name. This is the story of Julia Anderson. Julia Anderson was 39 years old, living in Mount Vernon, just north of the Bronx line. For more than 17 years, she worked as a caregiver at a group home in the Wakefield section, supporting adults with developmental disabilities. It wasn't a job she fell into by accident. It was one she chose to stay in, year after year, long after most people would have moved on to something easier. Omira Andino, CEO of the nonprofit where Julia worked, would later say there wasn't a single bad word spoken about her. At one point, the organization offered her a promotion, a step up and out of hands-on care work. Julia turned it down. She told them plainly she loved what she was doing, and she meant it, enough to stay exactly where she was, doing the work most people never think about until they need it themselves. Friends outside of work described her the same way: smart, hardworking, someone who carried a smile with her into every room she walked into. She wasn't chasing recognition and wasn't the kind of person anyone expected to end up at the center of a headline. She was a woman with a steady routine, a job she took real pride in, and a family she came home to at the end of every shift. She was 1 month away from turning 40. Nothing about the way Julia Anderson lived her life pointed toward danger. She wasn't tangled up in anything reckless. She wasn't a stranger to the people around her. She wasn't someone anyone had reason to worry about. She was simply a woman finishing another shift, heading home the way she did most nights, on a street she knew by heart. That ordinary routine is exactly what makes what came next so hard to make sense of. To understand what happened to Julia Anderson, you first have to understand the house she lived in and exactly who else believed they had a claim to it. The Mount Vernon home Julia shared was once owned by her grandmother, Isilda Foster. When Isilda died in 2023, the property didn't pass down to her son. It went instead to her oldest grandchild. It went to Julia. For Michael Foster, Julia's uncle, that decision reportedly did not sit well. According to court records, roughly a year before Julia was killed, Foster accused her of forging the deed to the home, the very document that legally established her as the rightful owner. Julia was arrested over the allegation. The charges against her, however, were dropped almost as quickly as they'd been filed. Julia didn't let the matter end there. She filed a lawsuit afterward, and in it, she made a pointed claim of her own. She alleged that investigators had built their case against her on the unverified word of a convicted felon with a documented past and a personal grudge against her. She was talking about her own uncle. That lawsuit was still working its way through the system when Julia was killed. No judgment had been reached. No resolution had come. What began as a dispute over paperwork had grown into something far more personal. Two members of the same family standing on opposite sides of a legal fight. Two members of the same family standing on opposite sides of a legal fight. Neither one appeared willing to walk away from, all while still living under the same roof in a home that was never supposed to come between them. By the summer of 2026, the legal question of who truly owned that Mount Vernon property remained unresolved. But for one member of that family, it seems the matter had already been settled in his own mind, long before the courts or anyone else had a chance to weigh in. Michael Foster was 58 years old, and by the time Julia Anderson's name made headlines in July of 2026, his name was already familiar to law enforcement in Mount Vernon. Decades earlier, in 1988, Foster was convicted in connection with the death of a man named Calvin Reed, also in Mount Vernon. Reed's name would later carry its own weight far beyond that case. He was the father of Ray Rice, the future NFL running back, though at the time, Rice himself was only an infant, far too young to have any memory of the loss that shaped his family's history from the very beginning. Foster served time for that conviction. Years passed. He rebuilt a life, at least on paper, one that eventually placed him back in Mount Vernon, back in the same house his mother had once owned, and back in close daily contact with a niece who had inherited what he believed should have gone to him. For Julia, sharing that home meant sharing space with a man who already carried a documented criminal record tied to a prior death, a fact she referenced directly in her own legal filing months before she was killed. It's a detail that reframes everything that came before it. This wasn't a family with an ordinary disagreement that spiraled out of control. This was a woman living under the same roof as someone with a documented past conviction for a serious offense, tied to her not by choice, but by inheritance and by blood. Monday, July 13th, 2026. Just before midnight, Julia Anderson had finished her shift at the group home, the same routine she'd followed for years. She was steps from the group home itself, close enough to see it, when she made her way toward her Jeep Grand Cherokee, parked along Murdoch Avenue near its intersection with Nereid. It was an ordinary end to an ordinary night. She'd made the same walk more times than she could count. According to police, a man approached on a scooter as Julia neared her vehicle. What happened in the moments that followed took only seconds. A brief exchange turned violent, loud enough that residents inside their homes heard something and came to their windows. 2 shell casings would later be recovered from the scene, evidence of just how close the encounter had been. Julia never made it into her car. She was found on the pavement, feet from the vehicle she'd been walking toward just moments earlier. The man responsible didn't stay. Police say he fled the scene on the same scooter he'd arrived on, disappearing into the dark before anyone on the block fully understood what had just happened. Someone called 911. Emergency responders reached her within minutes and rushed her to NYC Health and Hospital's Jacoby. It was there, a short time later, that Julia Anderson was pronounced dead. She was 1 month away from turning 40. A neighborhood that residents describe as quiet, the kind of block where nothing much ever happens, had just become the center of a case that would leave the entire community shaken. Officers from the 47th Precinct responded within minutes of the 911 call, arriving to a scene already marked by flashing lights and a growing crowd of neighbors stepping outside to see what had happened. The block, ordinarily quiet after dark, was now sealed off. The Jeep Julia had been walking toward, now standing behind police tape, evidence from the incident still visible on the vehicle itself. Detectives began canvassing the area almost immediately, going door to door along Murdoch Avenue, asking residents what they'd heard, what they'd seen. whether anyone had noticed anything unusual on the block earlier that night. Several told officers they'd heard what sounded like gunfire, but assumed it had come from somewhere else, a few blocks over, not directly outside their windows. At the same time, a separate team from the NYPD's crime scene unit made their way to the Mount Vernon home Julia had shared with her uncle, roughly a mile from where she was found. They spent hours there, processing the property, collecting evidence, working the case from both ends at once. Investigators didn't have to search far for a starting point. The relationship between Julia and Michael Foster was already on record, documented in the deed dispute and the lawsuit that had followed it. That history gave detectives a clear direction from almost the very beginning.
1. They moved on with speed rather than uncertainty. Behind the scenes, physical evidence from the block was being matched against information already gathered from that search. Piece by piece, a picture was coming together. One that pointed, with growing certainty, towards someone Julia had known her entire life. Someone who had shared her address, her family history, and now, quite possibly, the final moments of her life.
By Wednesday, July 15th, just 2 days after Julia Anderson was killed, detectives had what they needed. At around 7:40 that evening, Michael Foster was taken into custody in connection with his niece's death. He said nothing as officers walked him out of the 47th precinct, cameras capturing the moment in silence. The charges came quickly, and they came heavy. Foster was charged with murder and manslaughter, 2 counts that made clear prosecutors believed they had the evidence to support an intentional act, not an accident, and not a case of mistaken circumstance. But the charges didn't stop there. During the search of the Mount Vernon home Foster and Julia had shared, investigators recovered multiple unregistered firearms, a discovery that alone added 10 separate counts of criminal possession of a weapon to the case against him. 10 counts, on top of murder, on top of manslaughter. For a case that started with a single 911 call 2 days earlier, the scope of what investigators uncovered inside that house painted a far more troubling picture than anyone on Murdoch Avenue could have guessed. This wasn't simply a family dispute that ended in a single, isolated moment. It was a household where a documented history of violence, a pending lawsuit,
and an undisclosed collection of firearms had all existed side by side, quietly, until the night one of them was finally used. Foster was walked out of that precinct having said nothing, but the evidence collected against him would soon speak for itself in a courtroom just miles away.
The day after his arrest, Michael Foster appeared in Bronx criminal court. He stood before a judge and entered a plea of not guilty to every charge against him: murder, manslaughter, and the 10 counts of weapons possession stemming from the search of his home. His attorney offered no public comment following the hearing, and none has been issued since. The judge's decision that day came swiftly. Foster was remanded without bail, meaning he would remain in custody as the case moved forward, with no release option offered while he awaited trial. For a man accused of killing a member of his own family, the court gave no indication it viewed him as anything less than a continued concern. It marked his second time standing in a courtroom answering to a homicide charge. Decades earlier, He'd faced similar accusations over the death of Calvin Reed. Only this time, the person he stood accused of killing wasn't connected to some distant conflict from his past. She was his own niece, a woman who had shared his home, his family name, and until that July night, the ordinary rhythm of his everyday life.
As of the most recent reporting, no trial date has been set. The case remains active, working its way through the Bronx court system, with Foster held in custody and prosecutors continuing to build on the evidence already gathered from Murdoch Avenue and the home on the outskirts of Mount Vernon. What began as a family dispute over a piece of property has now become a matter for the courts to settle, in a case that started with an inheritance and has, for now, ended in an arraignment, with far more still to come. In the days following Julia Anderson's death, the weight of what happened settled over the people who knew her best. Her cousin, Clifford Walters, stepped forward to help the family with what came next. He started an online fundraiser to help cover funeral and burial costs, writing that the entire family was heartbroken and struggling to come to terms with what he called an unimaginable loss. He asked for support, not for himself, but to ease the financial burden weighing on relatives who were still trying to process what had happened, all while trying to honor Julia's memory the way she deserved. At the group home where Julia had spent 17 years of her life, the loss was felt just as deeply. Co-workers and the families of the adults she cared for spoke about her not as a headline, but as someone whose absence would be felt in the day-to-day, in the small routines she built with the people she supported, routines that had quietly shaped their lives for years. Neighbors on Murdoch Avenue, many of whom had lived on that block for years, described a strange disbelief in the days that followed. It was a street they'd always considered safe, uneventful, the kind of place where something like this simply wasn't supposed to happen. For them, Julia's death wasn't just the loss of someone they may not have personally known. It was a reminder that even the quietest corners of a neighborhood aren't guaranteed protection from what happens behind closed doors, inside a home, between people who were supposed to be family. Julia Anderson was gone. But in the weeks that followed, it became clear she'd left behind more than grief. She'd left behind a community that refused to let her story end quietly, and a family determined to see the case through to whatever came next. Julia Anderson didn't lose her life to a stranger, to a random act on an unfamiliar street. She lost it a few feet from her own car, on a block near the home she'd inherited, at the hands of someone who shared her blood, her address, and for a long time, her everyday life. An inheritance is supposed to carry forward the people who came before us. In this case, it became the fault line that split a family apart, long before the night everything came to a head. A deed, a lawsuit, a history that, in hindsight, carried more warning signs than anyone outside that household ever saw. Michael Foster now sits in custody, facing murder, manslaughter, and 10 additional charges, awaiting a trial date that is yet to be set. For Julia's family, there is no resolution yet, only the slow, uncertain process of waiting for the courts to decide what comes next. What stays with you about a case like this isn't just the loss. It's the reminder that danger doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes it lives under the same roof, sits across the same table,
and carries the same last name.
Julia Anderson spent her life caring for people who needed her most. In the end, the person she should have been able to trust most was the one who took everything from her. Her story is still being written, in a courtroom that hasn't yet set a date, by a family still waiting for answers, and by a community that hasn't forgotten her name. We'll continue following this case as it moves through the courts. If you want to see where it goes next, follow along with us. This isn't the last case we'll be covering, and it won't be the last time the truth turns out to be closer to home than anyone expected.